All right, looking at lesson number 2, page 13, the illustration that begins the lesson I think is interesting. It speaks of the specter of the Brocken, which is in Germany. And for many years there was a belief that when the sun would rise, that you could see the image of a god in the mist that arose above the top of the mountain. And then as the sun would rise, that image would disappear. Of course, it was later discovered that this specter, in other words, what you're looking at, was only the shadow of one who stood on the summit. And so as he would stand on the summit, the sun would rise behind him, projecting a shadow into the mist. It's anything that we might do or see on any number of occasions, obviously on a much larger scale because of the pinnacle of the mountain, etc. But the point is that the specter of the Brocken is not a whole lot unlike the Wizard of Oz. Most all of us have seen at some point the movie The Wizard of Oz, and in other words, there's a great projection that appears to be great and powerful, authoritative, but of course in the movie it's just, spoiler alert, it's just a little man behind the curtain. And so, and I hope I didn't spoil it for anybody. So, Jennifer, have you seen Wizard of Oz? Okay, just make sure. So there's, there's nothing to it. There's no substance to, substance to the image. And so, what John Kakelman, the author of this book, is moving toward in this lesson is that it has always been man's propensity to create gods for himself, and yet those gods that are created are like the specter of the Brocken or the Wizard of Oz in that they are simply images and there is nothing really behind them. There's no power, there's no substance to those things. And looking at page 14, under section number 2, it talks about the beginning of the Ten Commandments. And the beginning of the Ten Commandments is the sin of idolatry. In other words, God shows himself to be distinct from all the gods of the nations. By the way, when you see in the Old Testament, because we're going to read some passages or make reference to some passages, when you're reading in, both Testaments, especially in the New Testament, when it's quoting the Old Testament, the phrase the nations is synonymous with Gentiles. When you read about the nations, it's talking about everybody who is not a Jew. And so when you read about the gods of the nations, you're reading about the gods, the idolatry of the Gentile people. And so God begins the Ten Commandments by making a distinction between himself and the gods of the nations, or the gods of particularly the Canaanites, is obviously who he has in mind. And so the interesting thing is it did not take Israel very long to forget what God said about idolatry and build themselves an idol. Of course, the golden calf being the example of that. Now, under number 2, letter A, where it says modern man, I took out that word modern and I replaced it with the word Western, because we speak of Western civilization, that there is a pretty big difference between, and when we say Western civilization, we're talking about Western Europe and the United States, Canada, etc. That there is a vast difference in the thinking of Western civilization and a tremendous part of the rest of the world. And the reason I make that distinction is he says modern man will not become an idolater in the sense of the pagan mythologies of the Greeks, Romans, and the Norse. They bowed down to material images crafted with hands from precious metals, sacred wood, or rocks. Modern man is far too advanced for such primitive ignorance. That is just patently not right. It's just not right. So, but I know what he means by that. What he meant by modern man is he's talking about people who live in the modern era. In other words, our lives are marked by all the conveniences and the knowledge of the modern world. What we have to remember is that there are literally billions of people who do not live as and cannot even comprehend living in Western society. Even though there are great portions of Western society, for example, across the nation of India, yet more than 1 billion of those people are still Hindus. And Hindus have idols. I mean, literal, fashioned, formed idols. And in fact, if I'm not mistaken, every family in Hinduism has its own god. And they have images of those gods. And so I want us to be clear about what we're talking about. You know, I think I've probably told you, I know I have, it's been a long time, but you know, when I was in Ghana, the first trip I ever made to Ghana, I went to a grocery store, and that's using the term loosely. But in the back corner of that grocery store was a woman witch doctor. And she had all types of crushed up leaves and spices and all different types of things. And for a certain price, she could put a curse on your enemies. Now you think, well, that's the craziest thing ever. But you know, that's 1999. I made my first trip in 1999. And yet there are still people there, you know, basically practicing what we would refer to in our hemisphere as voodoo. Still practicing voodoo. There was a sign not far from the entrance to the school where there was a witch doctor who had spent time with the magic dwarfs. And there was a picture, a hand-painted picture of the witch doctor and 5 little images of dwarfs standing out there. And you could go and, again, for a price, you could get what you think you needed from this witch doctor who'd spent time with the magic dwarfs. Look, Buddhism is still an idolatrous religion. And look, if you just want to get right down to it, Catholicism is as idolatrous a religion as has ever existed. Catholicism is rankly idolatrous. I mean, they have their images, they have their icons. They worship those things. You know, I've been to the Vatican City, and I've been in St. Peter's Basilica, and I've watched people rub and kiss the feet of a bronze statue of Peter. And I've showed you pictures that his foot looks like this because they have rubbed it and kissed it for so many years that it has rubbed the toes off. Peter ain't got no toes. So don't tell me that modern, and these are people who live right in the middle of Rome, Italy. That's Western civilization. Right? But Catholicism is rankly idolatrous. Images of Mary, images of the crucifix that they all like to wear around their neck. The rosary is idolatrous. Well, I'll give you another example. You want to talk about idolatry? And by the way, you can look this up. You can Google it. I promise you'll find it. You can find an image and a story online from Mexico where somebody dropped some ice cream on the sidewalk in the hot day of Mexico, and they saw the Virgin of Guadalupe in the melted ice cream. And they roped that thing off, and people come around and prayed to it. Some cat burned a grilled cheese sandwich. And I don't remember if it was the image of Jesus or the image of the Virgin Mary was burned in that grilled cheese sandwich, and somebody paid $28,000 for it on eBay. Do not tell me Catholicism is not idolatrous. It's grossly idolatrous. And so, you know, before we begin to think that we're too sophisticated, you know, for idolatry, now look, they'll deny that it's But I got 2 feet with nubs on them that says otherwise. All right? And so even in Western society, there is a propensity for idolatry. Now, the type of idolatry that John is going to talk about ultimately is an idolatry that is simply a misrepresentation of who God is. In other words, anytime we take who God is and we change who God is, we've turned that into an idol, because when we change it, it ceases to be God. It's not God anymore. And it's just our image of what we like to think of in regard to God. In the letter B under number 2, I believe it's A.W. Tozier, makes this statement. It says, well, first of all, the introduction is, modern man's lure into idolatry is much more subtle and much more deadly. The danger is succinctly stated. Here's Tozier's statement. The essence of idolatry is the entertainment of thoughts about God that are unworthy of Him. It begins in the mind. The idolater simply imagines things about God and acts as though they were true. In other words, the person has fashioned not with wood, not with gold or silver, not with iron or brass, but they have fashioned in their mind an image of God. And they act on that thought as if it were true, and in so doing become guilty of idolatry. And then letter C, and I love this. Satan's scheme is not to get us to say there is no God, but to say there is a different God than what we have learned that the Bible teaches, and this scheme begins in our mind. I mean, as much as science purports to be able to prove, to try to show that there is no God and that God is not needed, atheism is not taking over the world. Have you ever thought about that? I mean, Darwin's Origin of the Species came out in like the 1850s, and it took the world by storm. And now evolution and godlessness has been taught in our schools. Scopes monkey trial, what, Scott? 1920? The Scopes monkey trial, Dayton, Tennessee. But basically, we'll just say post-World War II is when it started gaining traction. So godlessness has been taught as a matter of public education for the last 80 years, all right, or 70 years. And yet, atheism still has not managed to take over the world. It hasn't even taken over our country. I mean, the vast, overwhelming majority of people in the United States of America cannot separate themselves from the idea of God. No matter what's being taught in the schools, they cannot separate themselves from these things. Well, why is that? Because man knows inherently that God exists. And that inherent knowledge is so great and so overwhelming that while people may, by the way, I think there are a lot of people who deny that, would affirm that God does not exist, but down in their heart they know that He does. Let me give you an example of this. Y'all know I love Jordan Peterson. He's a sociologist. He's a professor at the University of Toronto. He has traveled the world over the last 5 or 6 years. Wrote a massive bestseller called 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos. A great book. Peterson, I've watched hours and hours of Peterson's lectures, seen him on television shows, interviews, etc. I saw him in an extended conversation with noted atheist Sam Harris. And Peterson could not bring himself to disaffirm the existence of Jesus and the resurrection from the dead. And it just drove Harris insane. He would not affirm atheism, but he would not disaffirm theism. From the first time I saw that, I'm thinking in the back of my mind, Jordan Peterson really does believe in God. And he really does believe in Jesus. But he's afraid of his standing in the world of scholarship. So therefore, he has constructed clever arguments in order not to affirm the existence of God and the existence of the actual person of Jesus. But Harris saw right through it. And anybody really could see right through it. Well, guess what happened in the last couple of years? Jordan Peterson had a mental breakdown. He had a mental breakdown. I mean, here's a guy that has helped literally millions of people. Guess what? And he's never really admitted this, but let me tell you what caused his breakdown. His belief in God and Jesus Christ. And the fact that he had been denying what he knew in his heart to be true. Guess what happened when Jordan Peterson came back from a lengthy hiatus? Guess what he is now? He's a theist. He's a professed theist. And he believes in the person. I'm not saying he's a Christian, certainly in the New Testament sense of the word. But he is, in a very general way, a believer. In other words, in spite of all of his learning, in spite of all of the scholarship, he still couldn't get away. Couldn't get away from what was inherent in his heart and his mind. It's what God has given to all of us. It's what God has given to all of us. Look, the fact that idolatry exists in remote portions of the world is testimony to the existence of God. Because men understand. Look, you can be in the remotest portions of Africa, and you don't have to be a genius to figure out that man cannot explain why everything exists. In other words, man's not sufficient in and of himself to say that some man produced this. And so that's why there is idolatry in many parts of the world, because man has an internal compulsion to believe in a higher power. Now it's up to us to teach them who that God is. Remember Paul at Mars Hill, Acts 17, the God whom you worship in ignorance, I declare him to you. And so we need to understand that man inherently understands that God exists. In 2 Corinthians 10 and verse 5, that's the passage here in letter C. The text says, casting down arguments and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God. Casting down everything that exalts itself against the knowledge of God. All right, top of page 15. The idolater today is not one who bows down before some image, but is one who has mentally modified the God of Scriptures, so that he, that is God, that his God is now more attractive, more tolerant, more permissive, more loving, less denouncing, less damning, less restrictive. Does that pretty well describe? Let me ask you this. Does that describe the God of denominationalism? That he's more tolerant, more permissive, more loving. By the way, more loving is completely, in their mind he's more loving. Because what? Because he is more tolerant. Because he is more permissive. Because he is less denouncing. He is less damning. He's less restrictive. But let me ask you a question. Is placing restrictions on people a sign of a lack of love? Or is it just the opposite of that? You know, I don't know what it was like for John to raise Eli in that shop when he was little. You know, but knowing that boy, I figured John always had his eyes in the back of his head trying to make sure Eli didn't decide to go play in the highway. Right? Bucket of oil. But the point is what? Well, if you love Eli, you let him do what he wants. Well, that's the attitude that people have today, isn't it? If you love your child, you let them do what they want. When actually the opposite of that is true. I didn't tear the hide off of my kids because I hated them. I did it because I loved them. I didn't rebuke them because I hated them. I rebuked them because I loved them. And by the way, I still rebuke my kids. They're married and they live on their own, but they're still not above being rebuked by their father. Now, why do I do that? Woodard? Because I love them. Because I love them. I've seen more than they've seen. And so the idea that more permissiveness, more tolerance is indicative of more love is it's false on its face. It's false on its face. By the way, Luke probably gets to deal with a lot of people whose parents let them do what they wanted. Is that right? People have never learned to respect for authority. Just did whatever they wanted to. Nobody ever called them. Nobody ever called them on what they did. And so we see the result of permissiveness. We see the result of being overly tolerant and less restrictive. And the picture is not pretty. But now, modern idolatry accepts, and I put this, the idea of biblical religion and the biblical God, but modifies each one to suit personal tastes. The result is a religion of convenience but no conviction. A God who is personal and up close but not sovereign. Adherents follow their feelings rather than faith. By the way, faith comes by hearing the Word of God. Faith comes by hearing the Word of God. If there is no Word of God, there is no faith. There is no faith. And that's what we try to explain to so many of our religious friends and neighbors about what they're doing. Like, if you don't have Bible for it, it's not part of the faith. It's not being done in faith or out of faith. It does not contribute to faith. And then the idea, a religion of convenience but no conviction. A religion of convenience but no conviction. I think this is probably best illustrated by the fact that so many, and by the way, I'm going to indict the church here as well, okay? I don't mean the church here. I mean the church in general. I'm going to indict the church as well as the denominational world in this matter. People will move to a community, and the teaching of the church that they attend is not as relevant as what the church has to offer them. Is that true, John? And once even semi-established in a place, if there's another place in the same town that seems or appears to offer more, then what? Let's pick up and move. But I witnessed this in my hometown when I was a kid. There was a cycle of popularity in my hometown. A town of 6,000. Well, technically, if they did with the city limits what Hamilton did, there'd be 12,000 people there. But because we had reasonable city limits, there's only 6,000. All right, but about 12,000 people in the school district. All right. I saw the Assembly of God become the popular church. I saw the Catholic Church become the popular church. I saw the First Baptist Church become the popular church. You understand what I mean by that? That whatever was exciting and happening at the time, and if you could get the kids there, you get the parents there. But there was absolutely no conviction. They were content to go just whatever made them happy. And we see that even in the church today. Look, I promise you right now, I can walk into the First Baptist Church in Hamilton, Alabama right now and probably find you 20 or 25 members of the Church of Christ. Is that right? Mason, is that right? I mean, you know about a lot of people go there, and you know they have ties to the church. I know a lot of people that go there, and I know they have ties to the church. Why are they there? Are they there because the First Baptist Church in Hamilton preaches the Bible and the Church of Christ does not preach the Bible? Is that why they're there? Or are they there because somebody let them sing in the choir or sing solos or has a great program for their children? That's a religion of convenience and not one of conviction. I've said this many times through the years. I'm going to tell you right now. All right? I'm going to draw a line in the sand. All right? They say never say never. All right? But I'm going to tell you right now. I will never leave the Church of Christ for another religious body. If I leave the Church of Christ, I'll just decide to be a heathen. I'll just be a heathen. You know why? I know too much Bible. I know too much Bible. By the way, think about this. How many people do we know in our community right now that aren't going to church anywhere? But they were raised in the church. And I'll show you, let me just throw this out at you. If they are about my age or older, they didn't go somewhere else. Does that make sense? They didn't go somewhere else. They just quit. And I'll tell you why. Because mine was the last generation where the Bible was being taught to the young people in a very structured and clear and unequivocal way. People in their 50s and up, if they leave the church, they just leave. They don't go somewhere else. People in their 40s and under, when they leave, they're just as liable to go somewhere else as quit altogether. That's religion of convenience. And I'd like to think that some of our brethren who've just quit still have some degree of conviction that does not permit them to go somewhere else. Which tells me what? There's still hope for them, right? There's still something in there. There's still something in there that we've just got to find. And we've got to find some way to find it and dig it out and reignite it. Yeah. And so that's the idea of religion of convenience as opposed to conviction. All right? Oh man, I'm running out of time. I'll just go ahead and start section 3. Let's go ahead and start it. I said we're going to get to Isaiah, and I need at least to keep my word on that. Isaiah chapter 40. All right, but here's what I want you to write down. Somewhere in the side gap on the left or in that little space between Pharaoh and Isaiah 40, I want you to write some other passages down out of Isaiah. All right? I want you to write down Isaiah 37. By the way, you don't even have to write Isaiah because they're all from Isaiah. Just write the numbers. Isaiah 37, 16 to 20. Isaiah 42, 20. 45, 17. 46, 1 through 9. Now here's what I want to do just to introduce these thoughts. Isaiah is prophesying to the people and warning them about the coming destruction that's going to be wrought at the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. All right? Isaiah was a contemporary of Hezekiah. Hezekiah was, he wasn't the last good king. His grandson Josiah was the last good king. Josiah was the king killed in battle at the time of the Babylonian destruction. But Hezekiah was being told by Isaiah that it won't happen in your days, but the day is coming when the Babylonians are going to come and they're going to carry everything out of this house. They're going to carry it all out. There's not going to be anything left. He said, and here's going to be the problem of the people. They're going to be idolatrous. They're going to practice idolatry. Now, Hezekiah was a reformer to the nth degree. He did, the Bible says, more than any king ever before him or after him in trying to restore a true and right religion. But look at what Isaiah, for example, look in Isaiah chapter 40, which, by the way, begins with John the Baptist. Isaiah 40 and verse 3 is the passage that is quoted in Matthew chapter 3, Mark chapter 1, about the forerunner, make straight in the desert a highway for our God. He's the forerunner in Isaiah 40 and verse 3. Then you get down to verse 18 of Isaiah 40. To whom then will you liken God? Or what likeness will you compare to him? The workman molds an image. The goldsmith overspreads it with gold. The silversmith casts silver chains. Whoever is too impoverished for such a contribution chooses a tree that will not rot. He seeks for himself a skillful workman to prepare a carved image that will not totter. In other words, if I can't afford silver, I'll go get me a piece of wood. And I'm not going to craft it because I'm not good enough to do it. But because if I do it, did you see that? He'll craft one that will not totter. What would happen if you gave me just a small cylinder type of wood, stick of wood, and you said, I want you to make me a candle holder. And I want you to carve it. I just want you to carve me out a candle holder. What are the odds of that thing standing up? Almost zero. If you want me to make you a candle holder that will not totter, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to put it on a bandsaw and I'm going to cut it straight on one end and straight on the other, and you're still just going to have a block of wood that's got two flat sides on it. That's the only way I'm going to do anything with it, and it doesn't totter. You understand what I mean by that? In other words, it takes a craftsman to make something that'll stand on its own. But the funny thing that Isaiah says is, if you try to make your own God, what's it going to do? It's going to be unstable. It's going to be unstable. Now look also at Isaiah, let me see if I want to go to 37. No, I don't want to do 37 yet. Let me do Isaiah 40, 42, 18. I said 42, 20. I'm going to tie this to Isaiah 45. The prophet says, hear, you deaf, and look, you blind, that you may see. Who is blind but my servant? Or deaf as my messenger whom I send? Who is blind as he who is perfect, and blind as the Lord's servant? Seeing many things, but you do not observe, opening the ears, but he does not hear. Now, there's going to be a picture of that in Isaiah 45. Look at Isaiah 45. No, 46. Go to 46. We'll skip 45. Look at verse 5. To whom will you liken me and make me equal, and compare me that we should be alike? They lavish gold out of the bag and weigh silver on the scales. They hire a goldsmith, and he makes it a god. And they prostrate themselves. Yes, they worship. They bear it on their shoulder and carry it. They set it in its place, and it stands. From its place it shall not move. Though one cries out to it, yet it cannot answer, nor save him out of his trouble. In other words, you're going to gather up gold, you're going to give it to a guy, he's going to fashion it into something, and then you're going to fall down before that thing and cry out to it and call it your God. But it can't see, it can't hear, and it can't move. In other words, if your God is going to move, you have to carry it. He's trying to show them how ludicrous their idolatry is. Again, on its face. How foolish is it to worship a God that cannot speak, cannot see, cannot hear, cannot move? And yet God's people were overcome with idolatry. They would not relent from that idolatry, and because of that, God had them carried away into Babylonian captivity. Let's go look at. Just going to find one more. Let's go look for one more passage where he mocks them. And for the life of me, I thought I had it written down, but I don't have it. All right, so next Sunday, we'll pick up in the passage on Isaiah with regard to idolatry, and then just by way of just kind of a review, and then we'll pick up on page 16.